Gather round, gunfighters, and let's have a good old cartridge talk. Better know a cartridge. Today's going to be a tale of two cartridges. One that I was fairly familiar with and one that I had no idea that existed, but the names are quite similar, even if the cartridges are quite different. Today's episode is going to be on the Shooting Times Easterner and the Shooting Times Westerner, both in 7mm. I'm doing this old school on the iPhone as I am on a trip with the wife right now. But if you listen for any length of time, you know the bio. And if you want to hear the bio, go listen to it on another episode. First and foremost, I am a servant of God and a follower of Jesus Christ. I've been blessed to do many other things in life. Been a professional gunfighter for most of my adult life. Also been a professional big game hunter and guide, and been blessed to hunt all over this beautiful country. Anyway, with that, let's get into today's topic. Let's start off with the Shooting Times Easterner. Now, this obscure cartridge starts off from an already obscure cartridge. If you're familiar with the 307 Winchester. Now, to explain this, you have to have a base knowledge that most traditional tube feed rifles, as in most of your lever action rifles, there are some exceptions, but most lever action rifles feed from a tube, which means that you need a rimmed cartridge. That's how the extractor grabs it, pulls it out of the tube, much like a shotgun that tube feeds. A shotgun round has a rim, right? So you kind of need that. Well, as popular as the 308 is, somebody had the bright idea of why don't we just make a 308 with a rim and then we can put it in a lever action gun. And they did that, and they called it the 307. Now, the 307 is basically a 308 with a rim. Well, as wildcatters often do, they said, how can we take this and make it a little bit better optimized? Let's neck it down to 7mm. And that, gunfighters, is the 7mm Shooting Times Easterner. So if you're familiar, analog to this is going to be the 7mm 08, which I think is one of the quintessential and best, probably, deer hunting cartridges of all time, and maybe even crossing over into elk and things like that. As far as efficiency and killing ability versus recoil, it is a great balance. And the regular 308 neck down is a 7mm 08. The 307 neck down is called the 7mm Shooting Times Easterner. So if you come across one of these, know what it is, know that it's cool. Or if you have a gun chambered in a similar cartridge, you may be able to get a custom barrel made for it for the 307. Or, as I was, for the 7mm Shooting Times Easterner. If you're doing this, you're probably already a hand loader. If you're into that kind of crazy, obscure cartridge stuff, it would certainly be a good, effective cartridge for, like it says, the Shooting Times Easterner, for a lever-action gun hunting in the eastern woodlands. I think it would be a fantastic cartridge. And I think it was worth a mention because even I didn't know about it. But it's apparently popular enough that there is load data for it. And let me pull up some of that load data for you ballistics nerds out there. As I am, I was just kind of nerding out over it. So let's take a look at those ballistic data charts here. And it lists two bullet weights. It lists a 120 and a 139. I'm going to pull that up here. And we've got the 120 grain at 2,900 feet a second. And this was just the first load that popped up, but they're probably going to be pretty close. But max velocity, max load, 2916 with a 120 grain bullet. That is very respectable. That's a decent cartridge. The next one is going to be a 139 grain bullet, and that's going to be at 2,700 feet a second. Again, that's very, very respectable. It's a good cartridge. It would be a good, medium game cartridge. You'd be even fine on larger game if you had proper bullet selection. If you could find, let's say a Nosler partition or something in that kind of bullet weight range. But I thought it was a really cool cartridge and worth mentioning. With that, let us transition over to one that I was more familiar with. And although it is a fairly obscure cartridge, it's much more common than the Shooting Times Easterner, and that is the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. I remember when I was a young gun nerd, when I was very young, I had a job as a lifeguard, and I remember sitting on my lifeguard stand when there was nobody in the pool and looking at reloading tables and data. I was even a ballistics nerd back then, and I remember seeing the 7mm STW, the Shooting Times Westerner, and thinking, wow, that thing is a hot rod of a cartridge, and it really is. A lot of people know and are familiar with the 7mm Remington Magnum. It is a quintessential large game hunting round of North America. It is popular and has been popular for decades for good reason. It puts big animals in the dirt. Well, what if you could get the 7mm Remington Magnum to the gym to pump some iron and get super bulky and get a little bit more power? Well, that would be the 7mm or the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. It is not based on the same parent case, if I remember correctly, and I didn't look this up, so verify for yourself, but I believe it was based on the 8mm Magnum, not the 8mm Mauser, but the 8mm Magnum. I believe the 8mm Remington Magnum. Again, verify that for yourself, but that's a bigger cartridge. It never really took off, although it's a phenomenal cartridge. I think it didn't take off because 8mm bullets of good construction are just not nearly as common. So somebody said, this is a great cartridge, it's super powerful, why don't we, again, wildcat it, neck it down to 7mm. And I don't know if it was a wildcatter that did this first or an ammo manufacturer, but somebody had the bright idea to neck it down to 7mm. And they did, and they called it the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. So the load data for this is pretty crazy and a good cartridge. So let me pull it up here. 7mm STW is looking at 120 grain bullet at 3,400 feet a second. That is hotter than a lot of varmint cartridges with like a 55 grain bullet. You know, and you're throwing a big game projectile out of there. 120 grain bullet is fantastic on deer size game, and you're talking about 3,405, and that was just the first load that popped up. You may even be able to get it hotter. That's a published load. And then you can load quite a different range of bullet weights. It goes all the way from 120 to 180. So, you know, talk about a sledgehammer. It lists the 180 grain at 2876 as a max load. And again, that's a published load. So that's quite a lot of power. I think it's a very underrated cartridge. Now, if you've listened for any length of time, you know that I don't like magnums. I don't own any magnums. I don't hunt with magnums. But if you are into magnums and you are into that maximum flat shooting cartridge point blank range kind of hunting, and you're talking about a cartridge that you can go out west and hunt elk and hunt bear and hunt mule deer and hunt pronghorn, you know, this would be a good choice. It's aptly named the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. Again, no amount of power is going to make up for poor shot placement. I've probably espoused that before in different ways in different episodes, but you have to have good shot placement, and even raw power and good shot placement, you still need a good bullet construction. So I wouldn't want a super light jacketed, non-bonded 120 grain bullet going that fast to shoot a big animal. But if you are wise in your bullet selection and the construction of your bullet and you have good shot placement, there's really nothing I can think of that wouldn't be put in the dirt, even at longer ranges with the 7mm STW. It's kind of fallen by the wayside, I think, because the 7mm Remington Magnum is already so good. But again, if you want something a little bit more powerful than that, or if you see a gun chambered in it, if you see a gun chambered in 7mm STW, or it says Shooting Times Western, now you'll know what it is. Or if you are looking for something and it pops up, just know what it is, and that it's a very good, effective cartridge. So both of those, the Shooting Times Easterner and the Shooting Times Westerner, pretty cool cartridges. Pretty obscure, but for some reason, a lot of people really like when I do these obscure cartridge talks. Also, honorable mention, you might want to check out that 8mm Magnum. That's a real cool cartridge in and of itself. May do a whole nother talk on that one day, who knows. It's pretty far down on the list. But there's also a cartridge, if you like the Shooting Times Easterner, you may check out the 730 Waters. The 730 Waters is a pretty cool cartridge. Maybe it deserves its own cartridge talk, but that is the 3030, which is kind of the quintessential iconic lever action round. The 3030. What if you took the 3030 and you necked it down again to 7mm? 7mm is a great all-around bullet diameter. What if you did that? Well, somebody did do that. I guess the guy's name was Waters because it's called the 730 Waters. So that's basically the 3030 neck down to 7mm, and it's quite a good cartridge. And although it is obscure, it's more common than the Shooting Times Easterner. So if you want a 7mm in a lever action gun, you may look at that. Anyway, with that, I hope you've enjoyed this. What I hope for you is an informative discussion on some pretty obscure cartridges. I am very humbled and blessed that anybody listens. Tactical tip of the day on lever actions. If you've ever thought about taking your lever action apart to clean it, don't. That's my tip for you for the day. They are kind of a steampunk nightmare of gears and gadgets and ratchets and levers and springs. My advice is, unless you're a really accomplished gunsmith or you want to throw stuff across the room getting frustrated, then take it to a gunsmith if it needs to be disassembled, or just take some brake cleaner or some gun scrubber if it's got a fine finish on it and literally blast it out of there, or powder blast or something like that, and then spray it down with some good Rem oil or something. But if you think you want to maybe take it apart, unless it's broken, don't take it apart, because it might be broken when you try and put it back together. Although lever actions have a reputation for being simple, and they're fairly simple to operate, the mechanisms inside are anything but simple. So that's your tactical tip of the day. Don't take apart your lever action rifle unless you absolutely have to, or you're a really accomplished gunsmith. Take it from somebody who knows from experience. Tactical verse of the day is coming at you from Deuteronomy chapter 10. Indeed, heaven and the highest heaven belong to the Lord your God, also the earth with all that is in it. Remember that next time you're out hunting or hiking or out in God's beautiful creation. That He created it. He is so much bigger and more beautiful and stronger than creation. But hopefully you remember that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and to be a good steward of it. And to enjoy it. For God gives us all things richly to enjoy. Anyway, with that, men, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.